The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, back with the second part of our three-part lecture on the Great Gate of Kiev, from Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition as orchestrated by Maurice Ravel. We left off right at the end of these really fun octaves in the left hand with the chords in the right hand, which we saw Ravel interpret in very ingenious ways, orchestrally. Now here in the piano score, we once again see senza espressione, so without expression. However, the dynamic is marked fortissimo. We're going to see whether or not Ravel interprets that the same way orchestrally. But needless to say, it's pretty much the same thing again. We can tell just by looking at the phrasing. We have a 5-bar phrase, and then this is going to be a 6-bar phrase with 3 more bars under this same slur on the next page. And just comparing, remember that the original passage that this is reflecting is in A-flat minor, right? Now this one is in E-flat minor. And it rises kind of the same way, leading onwards to this crescendo, then parenthesized back into a decrescendo, diminuendo at the end. So we can see it's not as lacking of expression as Mussorgsky might have indicated, but he just does want that cool sound there of very blank, unromanticized phrasing, really, is what I'm feeling. So things being simple and obvious. He might have also marked semplice at the beginning of that phrase. But otherwise, it's essentially the same thing again. Notice how it ends with these blank fifths, just as we did before, starting with A-flat minor and then ending with A-flat fifths. This is the same thing, E-flat minor, E-flat fifths. Then we get to this place here, where this is obviously bells tolling. There is a creepy chord hit very hard with a chime below on an A-flat, and it just kind of goes back and forth between two different harmonies. And this reminds me of nothing more than that scene from Boris Godunov, where it has something very similar happening. And I feel that this isn't necessarily a quote from Boris Godunov, but it is more of like a callback, right? One of Mussorgsky's greatest regrets was that Victor Hartmann had died just before Boris Godunov, Mussorgsky's greatest success in life, really, or in art, was performed, which he felt was a success in terms of the audience. And of course, critics gave it a huge beating. But that was his triumph, really. That was the high point of his creative life. And Victor Hartmann died before that was produced on stage. So I wonder whether or not this is intentional. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of the pain of that, of Hartmann not seeing his best friend's great triumph, is somehow reflected in this tragedy. Or maybe he just, that idea was a stray fragment left over from Boris Godunov. I don't know. But we see the harmony starting to develop rhythmically here, and these cascading harmonies here in the right hand as those bells keep tolling in the left hand. And then out of that, we eventually hear the melody assert itself in the harmonic figuration of the right hand. And really, really simple left hand. Notice how it's evolving into just like E flat, B flat, E flat, B flat, and so on. And over those call and response pedal tones, we just hear the great gate of Kiev sort of reassert itself. And I mean, I feel the sentiment here, as my voice is starting to crack. I understand what Mussorgsky is trying to say here. It's just his esteem for his friend is overcoming his own pessimism, right? And what gift could he give to the person that he liked the most in his whole life, right? Was this great artistic friend of his. And we just see that emerge from sort of chaos and depression, this beautiful, huge expression, especially how this climbs and climbs and climbs into this huge triumphal moment, and then the sweeping down to the very, very lowest possible notes. Then once again, the melody will come back as big chords to bash us over the head. But that is as far as we need to go for this lecture. As I mentioned before, it's a little bit more than I could fit into 2 lectures, and so I'm making it into very generous 3 lectures where I can spread out a little bit and spend a little bit more time on the details, but not necessarily have to cram too much information into too little time. Some of the difficulties that I would mention here for the orchestrator: the fact that Mussorgsky does have a bit of a symphonic approach here. He's using the pedal, and he's using the context, and he's using the phrasing in ways that are very orchestral. However, in order to do that, he indulges in a lot of what I would call pianism. In other words, really using the piano in a way that is unique to it and to the exponents of virtuosity, right? Sort of like Rubinstein, not Arthur Rubinstein, but Anton Rubinstein, the contemporary of Tchaikovsky and the Mighty Five and so on, who was considered to be like the greatest pianist in Russia. So we see some of that in this figuration. And so the challenge here for the orchestrator is, how do I make this all sound interesting? I mean, what is going on in the left hand here? Just these 2 pedal tones. Is that what I want to do with the whole orchestra? There's this suspended chord here. What is that going to sound like? What is going to be playing during this big sweep? Is it just going to be the entire orchestra sweeping downwards? What happens when this harmony is cut off, if so? How do I interpret this very slowly evolving optimism coming out of the darkness here? How do I interpret these figured melodic positions? How does that all work? So that was the big challenge for Ravel. So let's see how he interpreted all of that, and also see how he brought a little bit of freshness to this chorale here, which has, of course, returned up a 5th from its first appearance. But first, let's listen to the piano version so you can see what I'm talking about if you are not totally up on your score reading. So of course we're going to start with that chorale. And notice how the clarinets and bassoons are once again enlisted to fulfill those roles that they did before. And there is a little bit of difference in the fact that it starts with the clarinets in throat tones and lower clarino registers. And the bassoons, of course, start in their higher low register, going up into the tenor register, and so on. So it really is the same at the beginning, but Ravel brings some freshness into the entire exercise here by adding voices rather than changing voices. Do you see what I'm saying? So the bassoons still take on this role of providing the lower harmony all the way through. And the bass clarinet comes in here and helps fill out the harmony a little bit, right? So it's providing a little bit more harmonic texture here, using some notes that we're seeing in the flutes and so on, the clarinets, and just working sometimes outside, sometimes internally to what's going on in the bassoons, and it really fills it out as a woodwind chorale. Really, I feel the bass clarinet is actually more important here than the very simple strategy of just adding flutes to the clarinets, which of course is going to make it a little bit richer in overtones. And since the flutes are in an area where they can blend better with the clarinets, their middle register, then it kind of works, once again, a little bit wind-bandish and a little bit more just coloristically, as opposed to just thickening the texture, if you see what I mean. This is a case where, even though the third flute is a little bit lower, and it's got much less in the way of support from the other instruments. In fact, for the most part, it is just its own voice right there, with the first and second flutes and the first and second clarinets doubling each other. So this is just one little voice right there in the middle, but it works because everybody's playing very softly and considerately of each other. Things will flex a little bit here, going towards more warmth. You might say mezzo piano here, but I'd rather that you didn't, and just didn't think about one step up or one hairpin forwards necessarily having to be any particular gradation. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be mezzo piano. It could be mezzo forte. It could be poco forte, just right under forte. So it's really up to the players and how they balance and how they listen to each other and so on. But I see this just as a little bit of warmth rather than necessarily having to be any specific thing, right? So it's just warming up in the middle here. And that still allows the third flute to have its own unique voice and to balance with the others, even though it goes fairly low, all the way down here to D flat, right? So it's beautifully interpreted. Now there's a little bit more here to the passage. There's one more bar of this chorale, but we won't worry about that until the next part of this lecture. Let's just listen right up to here and see how all of that works, starting with the same voices as before, but of course up a fifth, so the beginning of this phrase is in a higher register. And then adding the flutes and bass clarinet, and really filling things out in a way that's still fairly subtle, not necessarily obvious or trying to be more than it is. Here on this next screen, you can see why I held this bar back. even though it's technically part of the chorale we just listened to. That's because we have the clarinets and bassoons playing those open fifths and then slurring into the downbeat at 110, going into the harmony that the horns are playing. Now, this looks very, very different, but just remember that we've got F on top, which is actually E flat, right? Which is the same thing as this note here, written B flat, sounding concert E flat, a fifth below. And then here we've got concert C flat and F natural, which are expressed here as written G flat and C in the horns. So it's the same exact harmony. So if this was done skillfully with everybody listening to each other, then you have a little bit of that essence of the relationship of tone between bassoons and clarinets and horns. There's a place at which their timbres are very similar. So if the horn players are listening to the winds that come before them and they want to sort of mix a little bit, they can somewhat adjust their tone so that they don't just come in like a bull in a china shop and knock everything over by being so incredibly different. The best kind of approach I've heard here from horn players is to make this accent really tight. Is to go bum rather than bum. Right, just to really kind of make it snap a little bit. So it's almost as if it's playing forte for just a second and then dragging back a little bit to mezzo forte or even mezzo piano compared to everybody else's dynamic, right? And then same thing down here. We have a low concert A flat, which is actually the same note as this right here. Of course, this is transposing by the octave. So it's really this A flat space right here in the cello staff. But anyhow, be that as it may, it's all the same pitch, and so is this, right? This is written B flat in the treble staff for bass clarinet. Think down a major ninth. So that makes it A flat in the bass staff concert. Okay, so the bass clarinet here is carrying on the fourth horn player's low written E flat, right? So these two instruments can also blend together really beautifully. And the bass clarinet can just feel like a carryover of the timbre of the horn if the horn player really listens to the bass clarinet player and just gives its tone over into that sustained note. One thing that's very cool here is that the horns tie and slur across into this harmony here without stating that same accent again. The accent is just given to the third player, right? And then the answering low note is played by tuba without any kind of sustaining instrument. Now, one thing that I am going to get to in a second is the role of pizzicato here, but let's wait for a second on that. On the downbeat of each bar, we've got the tubular bell playing. Here it says E, but really E flat is probably going to be used by the percussionist. In addition to the bell, we've also got the cymbals and tam-tam both being allowed to continue to sustain their tone, right? It says let vibrate, right? So just allow the sustain to continue onwards. And that helps to accent these low upbeats, right? So downbeat with a chime and upbeat with a tish or a boosh, right? And of course, those are just coordinating with the low notes here, either on fourth horn or on tuba. And there is a relationship between fourth horn and tuba. Once again, tuba is a conical instrument, and so is horn to a degree, although it's a half-tube instrument, so it doesn't have that really big, expansive, low register that the tuba does. But they really do have a related timbre, especially when you have an experienced low player like this. And, of course, you get down into the low register of a horn and you don't accompany it with the other low horn, so it's really exposed, and you give it an accent. Then you get a sort of a barking sound. Of course, that barking sound is somewhat ameliorated by the bass clarinet. That really does underline a similarity with the tuba as well, so that's just more beautiful timbral control on the part of Ravel. Then if we talk about the strings plus the harp, we've got the violas playing pizzicato here, along with the first harp plucking some chords. And then, of course, the cellos and the double basses are having a conversation in pizzicato of what's going on between the third and fourth horn, or the third horn and the tuba. Really, it's the same basic pitches going on there. And that just emphasizes it a little bit. But really what you'll hear here is the brass, mostly, and the chime. The harp will be a little bit more difficult to hear, and well, you'll hear some pizzicato and some harp, but it will not be all that prominent in the face of these accents being played by the horns. Now, this approach continues on, right? It's just basically the same thing for everybody above the strings. There really is no change at all. But what we get here, just for about 4 bars, we have some of the strings change over to 6/4 time, which doesn't matter a huge amount to the conductor, because the conductor will still be giving us the downbeat and the upbeat, right? Just to keep everybody on course. It's just that the second violins, the upper divisi, violas, and cellos are going to be playing essentially triplets over that cut time. And this is a fair approximation of what the right hand did before. Very conveniently, there doesn't have to be any difference here. This can continue on the way that it was before. It doesn't have to boil itself down to smaller and smaller notes. And that becomes especially handy when we go back to cut time here, and the violins, instead of doing all that swooping and diving and everything else, just start to play a measured tremolo. Now, this measured tremolo is really just 4 notes, so you might be thinking, well, why bother? But it's just easier to read when you're in a hurry. So just, for instance, going back and forth between F and E flat a couple of times. And this is essentially the same harmony that we saw in those cascading figurations, right? And so it doesn't really need to have that energy in it, because we have a different kind of build here. In this case, really everybody's playing piano, and there's nothing really changing here in the background. So it's a question of building literally by just adding parts, which is another great thing that Ravel could do without even putting in any kind of crescendo. Of course, this is a case where the conductor might start to get excited and broadcast that excitement a little bit at the players, and the players might start to involuntarily crescendo, or just expect that a crescendo is expected, but to really hold it back and just to allow the addition of the first violins here and the introduction of more notes per bar going back and forth is really enough to add energy here. It does not need any kind of crescendo. It is going to have a slightly bigger sound. So listen for how all that works. Just this very stripped back texture here, just pizzicato accompanying what's going on here in the brass and the percussion, and a little bit of bass clarinet there. And then how the strings sort of add this back and forth interpretation of what the right hand was doing in the piano score, with still a little bit of pizzicato all the way through here. And then how the frequency of the notes increasing, plus the addition of the first violins, also adds energy without really having to add a crescendo at all. Right? Listen for all of that, and then we'll see what Ravel comes up with next. So now we have two screens in a row that really cannot be broken up. So even though these are massive tutis, let's just make it all one big thing here. First of all, let's just look at the pulse, right? There was this kind of a callback to Boris Godunov, which we heard in the horns, and then, a little bit of push from the fourth horn and the tuba and so on and so forth, and kind of back and forth between cymbals and tam-tam and bells. And we see some of that on this page, right? So we see the chime continuing to hit on that E flat all the way through here. And it really just becomes a phenomenal part of the texture when the melody suddenly starts to spring out of this massive texture that's fluttering back and forth. And I feel that this is really old school. This is really like a page right out of Rimsky-Korsakov. I feel that Rimsky-Korsakov would have heard this interpretation, and yeah, of course, like, he wouldn't have been happy with anything. He wouldn't have cared how great Ravel was or what his reputation was or whatever. He had his own way of doing things and so on. But I think that he wouldn't have objected too much, and I think he would have seen a lot of reflection of his own mastery in this particular approach here. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. We have the cymbals and the tam-tam continuing to trade off. And notice that he's adding a little bit of energy now. Mezzo piano, mezzo forte, then he brings it back down to piano. And then here, he really pushes into this next page. Of course, building the energy right along with him, we see some timpani here. But when it gets to this point, the timpani just backs right off. And Ravel allows the natural percussiveness and rhythmic pulse to suffice for any sense of emphasis. Of course, in addition to the metallophones that are sort of chiming and tishing along on the bottom here. But then we hear some timpani come back in here, getting those upbeats. All right. So that context is just really something I wanted to point out before I broke down each of these three individual sections. So we've got that upbeat, downbeat thing happening in Harp here. We've also got the pizzicato continuing on, crescendoing. We've got the tuba and third trombone trading off on these low B flats. And by the way, low B flat is a great note for trombone. So this doesn't have to be a bass trombone. I mean, it would be even more powerful if it was. But just playing this as an open fundamental in first position sounds fantastic in the context of everything else that's going on here. It's just a full, fat note. And it is a really great trade-off note with the tuba. Notice that even though this looks like dovetailing, it's intended to be emphasized along with these hits, along with this pizzicato and harp playing these low tones. And we see a little bit of support as well from the A2 bassoons, which are put in there just to help the third trombone and tuba to have a more similar timbre in the ear of the listener. But be that as it may, every half bar we get an accented note going back and forth. Notice the accent is left out here. That's either accidentally by the copyist or basically Ravel just saying, well, just delay the emphasis until you get to hear it, and there's definitely a forte so that you don't swamp everything. That those little details might be intentional and they might not. So that sort of takes care of the rhythmic pulse, right? And it's nice that the trombones come in here with this real solid E flat. And that way the horns don't have to do as much work. They can basically support the harmony on top. Notice here's a rare occasion where Ravel decides to let the horns work in two separate pairs rather than forcing them apart a little bit. Ravel tended to almost always err on the side of caution and have the third player match up with the first rather than just have the first and second work together as a team. But here, this is the obvious thing to do, especially going forwards, right? And here he has, once again, a rare A2 passage for first and second. This is actually what I would do. I feel that this is the more sensible approach. But then we see going on that Ravel decides to separate them out once again and have B-flat octaves in the low horns and then the melody taken over in the high horns. And some of that is just because things are sort of pushing a bit high, right? Things are going up to F, and he just really wants a really secure, powerful sound up there, especially as right now it'll be right around forte, right? So here, this is okay. He keeps the second from going all the way up to F here because it's going just to the C, right? And then trades things off when he really wants it to be more powerful. That, I don't know. I mean, I think even that makes sense to me too. All right, I'm not going to bicker with that or argue with that. Okay, I think that's fine. Here, I might have given this to the fourth horn because the third horn player is going to be jumping down from that F. I mean, yeah, it's totally possible and it's fine, but the fourth is already sitting on that B flat. It doesn't really need any help at all, right? So, anyways, but those are just like druthers of different approaches. Not necessarily anything fundamentally flawed. Okay, so back to these first four bars. We can just see this gaining in power the same way that we do in its sort of figured form, right? And Ravel very considerately allows a little bit of rest so that the divisi lowest firsts and seconds have a little bit of time to let go of their arco and get ready to play pizzicato. Same thing with the lower divisi violas. And to an extent, this harmony is just reflected in the winds, more or less. You know, it's kind of the same thing with the piccolo way on top there on a high E flat. And that just gives a little bit of sheen here to the harmony, rather than necessarily standing out as a very powerful thing. Softly played piccolo is just a wonderful little color to add on top of things, just so long as it doesn't become too dominant. And that just sets up this beautiful tutti here, where the melody once again just leaps right off of the page and into your ear. Very simply done, really, when you think about it. It's pushing the oboes a little bit high, going all the way up to F there, but that's a note that's easily handled. Especially when it is doubling elements in the strings, it just feels all very natural. Very cool here that the third oboe comes in and plays a little bit of this connecting harmony here, just basically doubling what's going on here in the second violins, just for half a bar, and then letting go as the oboes come back in to play that second half. Same thing is happening here in the clarinets, which are scored ottava just here in the score, not in the parts. And that's because vertical space is at such a premium here. So we have flutes and clarinets basically playing unison at first, right? And then going to harmonization on the second half of each beat as the flutes leap up to that high B flat, right? So it just goes a little bit too far for Ravel. But he can still ask them to play that high written A, which is really a G in concert pitch. That creates a very, very powerful, very pearly upper line with that approach. Interesting that the piccolo could really support here, especially going up to those high B flats without being too intense on the ear. And yet Ravel decides to just leave this as rests and say, hey, go to the grand flute. Here's that melodic statement. It's basically being doubled by these tremolos in the upper ranks of these divisi violins. And, of course, let's not forget that supported from below is this beautiful three-part harmony from the trumpets. And their overtones will support everything that's going on here in the upper winds and just really give it a lot of push from below. And really, goes all the way up to B flat. This is a case where it's best to let the trumpets play in their best register and the winds to play in their best register, right? Rather than pushing the trumpets too high and then having to go up to screechy places or to compromise too much in your melodic arc. Meanwhile, some of the same elements are going on here as before. In terms of the support, we've got those accented E flats in the trombones, and everything else is going on that I mentioned before. And pizzicato is emphasizing a lot of the basic melody. Now, what is really cool here, speaking of icing, is the harps basically playing a version of the melody. Notice how these quarter notes are spread across the hands, and it's just easier on the harpist, especially at a little bit faster tempo. So roll, 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 right? It's just easier to break it up that way. Now, of course, these are going to be an octave apart, right? So this is just basically jumping up. So we don't have the F in that same register, but it doesn't matter because of just the way that the harp sounds. It'll fool the ear if you can hear it at all. But it's a great place for the harps to be completely doubling all the way through, just so that some noise gets through. And the ear will just be focusing on the glockenspiel or keyed glockenspiel right here, playing that very, very high tone, right? So that is another strong argument for not having the piccolo play, because the piccolo will possibly contribute too much, right? And dominate or just maybe join together a little bit too cutesily, right? You don't want to be too cutesy, right? And this sweep up here is really, really fun. And it's a great example that composers can either forget everything they know about orchestration or apply wishful thinking or just be careless, right? Because here's a written low B flat for flutes. And there's ways of kind of faking this. Sometimes players will get the low B flat written in Tchaikovsky by resting the base of the flute against something, like maybe the stand or their knee or, I don't know, some other kind of approach, or they'll try to play that first note out of tune or whatever. But here, probably the safest thing to do is to not even play that note and just come in on the D as you do this riff, because nobody's going to hear that note anyways. It doesn't matter how loud the flutes are playing. It could be A3 here and nobody would hear the flutes until about right around here. Just because of the density here with the oboes, which will be very, very loud pretty much through their whole range, and same thing with the clarinets. So the flutes are at a huge disadvantage for the first half of bar. And of course the harps are going to be dominating anyways because that big swoop, along with these upsweeping 16th note tremolos. That's really going to be what everybody hears, plus the horns pushing, right? This is kind of neat that the horns push out along with the bassoon family and the trombones while the trumpets get swallowed before they come back in, right? And they're going to be playing these two bars again, coming back into it, and pretty much everything very much like as before in all the instruments. It's a good strategy. Why waste it just to try to be different every time? And I really like this slow building of energy here. So dropping back down to mezzo forte crescendo, the strings basically adding harmony, climbing higher and higher. The pizzicato strings going back to arco and sort of joining in a doubling of what's going on in here in the oboes and the clarinets. And then everything ending up here with the harps chiming back and forth, the tuba coming in here on that half a bar, along with the bassoon family, and all the rest of the brass hitting the downbeat really strongly. This is really what you're going to hear here. Like all of this other fluttering stuff is just going to be harmonic icing on top. you won't even hear these harps at all. I mean, it's kind of fun for them to play it, so I would say don't leave it out, but it's not really something that you're going to be hearing if you've set your heart on this in a similar approach as an orchestrator. This pizzicato will come through, though, along with this timpani that I mentioned before. So that is setting everything up for this massive sweep downwards, which we saw in the piano part as well. But notice how Ravel holds on to the harmony. Remember I was saying, like, what do you do when you have this big swoop going down the hill? Do you just cut out the rest of the orchestra? Ravel's answer is no. He has pretty much all the brass just play this big, huge suspended chord all the way through, fortissimo, and then a big push at the end, and then a pausa. All right? Beginning with a big timpani hit, cymbal strike, and chime. And of course, nobody's going to hear these harps in here, but whatever. Just add them for fun, I guess. The winds are basically just kind of playing on top of each other on their way down, right? So, right? And just like working their way down little by little until they really sweep downwards and do some more of that kind of trading off that we talked about before. I'm not going to belabor the obvious here by going through all of it, but yeah. But pretty much upper winds and upper strings working together, going towards the middle, and then just climbing around and doing this big swoop up and then back down again. I really love this emphasis here. Pizzicato, just hitting that middle of the bar, along with a fortissimo piano accent here in the upper winds at the top as well. So it's like a snapping kind of an accent. Really, this is almost like an echo of the timbre that we are hearing in the strings as well. So it's just a really effective way of dealing with that. If there had been a tiny little cymbal strike or snare note, then that would have made perfect sense, because you really want that biting sound there, but it's not really necessary. It's just a thought of mine. It's going to be hard for anything to be made out here if the players really are playing fortissimo and then swelling here. I've heard some orchestras kind of go fortissimo accent, then down to about mezzo forte, and then pushing here and actually pushing out all the way rather than swelling in the middle of the bar. There's all sorts of different interpretations here, but I feel that Ravel's is the best. It is basically playing a balanced fortissimo, so that would really be more like a forte accent against everybody else's fortissimo, and then really going to a true fortissimo here and back down again. I feel that that's probably the best way to approach this in terms of a balanced interpretation. In fact, that's kind of what this page says to me when I look at it, just compensating and balancing in my own mind. So let's listen to both of those screens now. Of course, when you get to here, think about those swoops downward, and then the way this sort of bites off right at the end here in the middle of the bar with the pizzicato and the fortissimo piano accent. And listen for the swell here, and then that wonderful hush when the pausa takes over, and you have this fermata double bar line, and of course the effect of that harmony underneath all of this furious activity. But even more importantly, how we build to that point, right? How the harmony starts to push out here in the lower winds and brass, and how the flurries kind of evolve all the way there throughout this entire screen, right? Listen for the harps. If you can hear them right in here, you'll hear them here. And for how this melody is interpreted with just really straight wind scoring and the clarinets doubling with the flutes behind this melodic interpretation splayed across rhythmic figuration, right? And of course you'll hear this glockenspiel line at the top, or jeu de timbre line at the top here. So listen for all of those things, and I'll see you in a day or two for the final lecture of this entire Pictures at an Exhibition series, which I'm really looking forward to. And After the upcoming activities of the middle of this year, I will be back for more orchestration lectures with a very, very cool piece, in fact, which I'll announce in a couple of months.